Okay, I'm working on some vectors here for an invention. Maybe not an invention as much as a design. A design for a bandsaw stand. I'm making my vectors so that I can go to the Torchmate table, my Torchmate 4400, and I'm going to use these vectors to cut out this design. When you're working with vectors, it's the way to translate into a cut path, and this is what I'm doing here. In that set of vectors, I have all the parts I need to make this stand that I'm about to make. Like I said, it's a crazy concept, and I took a look at the bandsaw, the handheld chopping bandsaw, and I decided the three most important things: to stand on its bottom, to stand on its top, and then to cantilever like a chopping bandsaw. And I try to solve all those problems without having to attach and unattach several different things, and that's what you're gonna see me create here. I gratuitously put my name in it just for fun because I'm still learning how to use the Torchmate, and I like the idea of being able to incorporate type into designs, and of course I always play with my logo. So this is the framework that's going to basically be the foundation for the design. I wanted to make something that cradles and carries the bandsaw, and there's a little bending fork that I made, and I was able to use it to kind of use as a cutting guide as well. I'm using 16 gauge sheet metal, and in and of itself it's kind of weak for what I'm doing, but I didn't want to use anything heavier because this obviously is going to add some weight, and if I'm careful with my design, I'm able to have opposing planes that create strength the same way an I-beam creates strength. And I'm using small tacks because I do not want to melt the metal. It's difficult for me, I'm not a professional welder, but it's difficult for me to weld sheet metal and not burn through. So my solution is to add the tacks. And I actually like the way it looks, so I don't mind putting the tacks. I like the riveted look. To me, I'm always going for the industrial, sort of recycled industrial look, and that's what you have here. And you see me putting the parts on now. These are going to be the ends that create a triangulated shape. And I'm slowly filling out my design. I have a concept, and this is sort of my first working breadboard. I did make these shapes out of cardboard initially, just regular corrugated cardboard, just to get my bearings on the idea, to feel out the idea. And like I said, you see me just adding different pieces. Some of them I cut out of the sheet, some of them I had. That happens to be a rod, a piece of flat stock. And here I have my initial design done. And of course I realized it was a little weak, so I had to put in these cross members, which added a tremendous amount of strength. And the weight of it kept it a little bit off center. So by cantilevering it a little bit or just tilting it a little bit with these screws, ultimately I could add a little bit of a bigger base, but I just wanted to kind of stick with this thinner design. The DeWalt has these big rubber edges that are sort of fastened in place, and I just put sheet metal screws directly into the rubber, which was more than enough to keep the bandsaw where it needs to stay. So 4 screws keep it right where it needs to stay. And you'll notice it's been sitting in there friction fit for quite some time. And now I'm working on what's going to become the brace that's going to be the pivot spot for the cantilever. And I just tack it initially because I just want to make sure that it's in line with the blade. Just use a piece of scrap to check that. And I just put a few heavy tacks to keep it in place. Like I said, I could still remove it if I needed to. And now I'm actually using the bandsaw to cut the stock that's going to create the table for the chopping capabilities. And I just cut a quick square. I use the shape designer that's within the Torchmate software just to make a quick shape. It's funny because I would have just, before I owned the Torchmate, I would have just kept that whole piece as is. But now I want it to be a little bit more specific and, of course, just practice. I'm always wanting to practice my cuts and my setups on the machine. And there I am, just using the machine again. I'm creating basically the other half of the hinge that T-shape I made a few scenes ago is going to be one part of the hinge, and here I'm creating the other side of the hinge. I'm using another piece of the same rod stock to give me the height. And now you see I'm using the rod stock as a spacer for those top flanges that are going to carry the rod that's attached to the T-shape. And I kind of made a mistake. I realized I need to remove that piece if I want the saw to stand up, to go all the way through and stand up like that. So that's why I had to cut that piece out. There's a couple of other designs I've already considered that are better than that. But again, this is my first prototype, my first working prototype. If anybody has any improvements on this, please feel free to let me know, or make your own version of it as a counter answer to this. And because the bandsaw blade doesn't sit perfectly flush to the exterior of the housing of the bandsaw, I had to raise up the cutting stage a little bit here. And that's what you see me. That's going to be my backstop for the cut. And I'm making sure I weld at least on a few spots, because right now as I'm about to make my very first cut through the backstop and the plate, I want to make sure nothing falls apart. And so now what was one piece is now two pieces. And here I just do a quick test cut, and you can see how I can cut some dainty rod if I needed to. And now I am going to paint it. Take it apart. The cord is always a pain in the butt. It always seems to get in the way, but until I have a battery operated chopping bandsaw, I'm going to have to deal with the cord. Paint is dry. I'm going to reassemble it, which only takes a couple of seconds. And there you see I put the screws back in quickly, and there we have our stand-up. It's upside down, so I can pick it up from a standing position on the floor beside me. And there's the chopping capabilities. And there's one thing I forgot, and that's to make the actual plate. And there you see me just going through some of the motions just to feel it out. And this is the plate. And I just put some stoppers, and it's friction fit. I made it and it slid on too easily, and then I literally gave a tack weld inside one of the walls, and that was enough friction to keep it stuck on with a tap of a hammer. And now here's my beauty shots, just showing off that it actually works. And when that bandsaw's sitting on a table with some friction, it doesn't go anywhere. And there I am, just using it against the table itself and picking it up and putting it down on its head, which is probably the way I use it the most. And now again, if I had to cut some dainty material, repetitive cuts, I have a good chopping station to do that with now. And there you go. Thank you for watching. If you have any improvements on it, make a video and let's see it. Thank you, Lincoln. Thank you, Torchmate.